from my dissertation as I continue to rework it for a book. So William Zeckendorf and I am Pei, certainly a timely topic given Pei's recent passing, the incredible age of 102 years old, and to look at some of his earliest years in practice in real estate development. So Zeckendorf was the most ambitious real estate developer in the United States in the 1950s. He had visionary plans and a larger-than-life personality to match that. And unlike most of the developers of the era, he really believed that quality design, urban planning in the largest of scales, and creative financing were critical to remaking city cores through urban renewal. And to accomplish this, he hired I.M. Pei, the talented young Chinese architect, who had distinguished himself even among the elite peers at Harvard's Graduate School of Design to create a scenario that fundamentally changed the working relationship between a developer and architect. Pei joined Zeckendorf's firm at Webb & Knapp as the Director of Architectural Construction, Research and Design in 1948, and together this unlikely duo became the most active urban renewal architect and developer in the country. Zeckendorf and Pei's urban empire stretched coast to coast. Here they are on a photo shoot. They were remaking huge portions of Denver, Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Montreal, and Los Angeles, frequently through the advantages of the federally funded Title I Urban Renewal Program, primarily for their housing work. The quality of their collaboration had a direct impact on the execution of this incredible volume of work. Zeckendorf anticipated and generated major shifts in New York City neighborhoods through his talent for finding unnoticed and undervalued properties and striking multi-million-dollar deals, leading to some of the largest real estate transactions of the 20th century. He famously assembled the land for what became the United Nations in an 11th-hour deal with Mayor O'Dwyer, Robert Moses, and the Rockefellers to get the UN to select its East River location. It was his vision for the property, which is here on the left, which he called X City, that Wallace K. Harrison designed, that sold the idea to the UN. Zeckendorf didn't just value design, he was himself visionary and created opportunities for meaningful architecture and design. And he became the loudest developer cheerleader for urban renewal of the era and published articles and spoke prolifically on the subject. Zeckendorf, I would argue, is the most important client of Pei's career in that it launched the young architect into the national spotlight, providing him with the opportunity to design and build his first structures, experiment with materials, and learn how to manage a large design team. Their relationship was mutually beneficial. Pei's decision to join Zeckendorf at Webb & Knapp also surprised many of his colleagues and was frowned upon at the AIA because it blurred professional boundaries. Of course, Pei and Zeckendorf were not alone in their exploits, and they surrounded themselves with no less than a small army of talented professionals in finance, law, PR, and a growing design team, which would include Henry Cobb, Easton Leonard, Don Page, James Polshek, and James and Gottfried, and more. Within a housing and funding system that encouraged the building of cheap land and familiar, Zeckendorf and Pei developed a formula to transcend bleak box-like urban renewal stereotypes in favor of dynamic facades and innovative use of materials, mixed-use buildings, landscape design, retail, and art. The developer and architect were out to prove that in speculative development, profit and quality design did not have to be mutually exclusive. They leveraged their creativity against the constraints of lending institutions, and their strategy shows a more diverse approach to the history of urban renewal, more than one of just failed policy. The developer and architect were envisioning a new social landscape and created durable architectural scenarios for enriching the daily lives of the new families who lived there. Of course, this was at the significant cost of displacing thousands of working class individuals, often minorities, and commercial establishments from their homes and places of business, who could not always afford to move back into the new middle-income or luxury apartments and commercial establishments on the new site. In this way, Zeckendorf and Pei fell prey to the biggest downfalls of urban renewal, this massive displacement. And yet, these projects, now 50 years later, have become communities in their own right, beloved by long-term residents who have made them their home. So in the post-World War II era, the decentralizing cities, urban redevelopment was embraced as the urgent solution to replace old housing stock, draw middle-class families back from the suburbs, and increase tax revenue for the city. We're looking here at the clearance project for the NYU Bellevue. The federal funds available through Title I of the 1949 Housing Act provided the means for municipalities to condemn and reclaim so-called blighted areas and decaying city cores through eminent domain and then resell them to the private sector, the developer or sponsor, for reconstruction under public controls. The cost to the city for assembling and clearing the site was greater than the market value of the land, and therefore a write-down was necessary. The city assumed 1/3 of the loss, and the federal government took on the other 2/3 of the loss. As a program, it embraced the arguments of the planning reformers from the 1930s for planned communities and tower on the park superblock strategies and low density in lot coverage and people per acre, as this exhibit so wonderfully demonstrates. The Title I program experienced many problems from the outset. Developing on so-called slum sites, predominantly inhabited by minority populations, was a risk that most investors, realtors, and builders avoided. While supporting housing construction, the FHA followed the risk-averse logic of lending institutions and therefore undermined the Title I urban renewal goals and created a relationship of constant tension with developers like Zeckendorf. Unfortunately, baking buildings, like predictable loaves of bread, became policy as well, baked into the FHA lending practices to rationalize and prescribe sound investment. The pace for Title I projects did not pick up across the country until the passage of the 1954 Housing Act, and with it Section 220, under which developers could receive guaranteed first mortgages through the government. The responsibility to initiate a Title I project in New York or in any given city fell to the local planning agency or slum clearance commission, which would declare a certain area substandard and through the power of eminent domain condemn large tracts. Local planning officials would then set forth an analysis for reuse of that land. Only then would private capital, like Zeckendorf, be invited to submit redevelopment proposals to purchase the land, agreeing to develop it in line with the direction dictated by the local planning commission as part of their original proposal to the federal government. The government provided up to 90% of the funds for the new construction, provided that very specific criteria be met. In New York, Robert Moses led what would be the largest slum clearance program in the United States as chairman of the Mayor's Committee on Slum Clearance, and he would serve as the city's construction coordinator. As Hilary Ballin has explained in her excellent work on Moses, he was the intermediary between the government and the private investor. He had to convince developers to enter the program and operated differently from the federal guidelines here in New York in that he paired the city and the sponsor before the sale of the actual land, for which it was very controversial, and the selection of the sponsor was highly secretive. Webb and Knapp sponsored 8 Title I urban renewal projects in the United States, 5 of which Page designed that you see here. They were worked on almost simultaneously, predominantly from 1953 through the early 1960s. Page designed 2 Title I projects with leaders, a parade of really beautiful promotional materials hauled across the country in Zeckendorf's private plane. Page did not design Park West Village as the most notorious project. I just want to touch on it briefly to show the difference between what we'll see in Page and the team's really elegant, urban planning schemes here in New York. But Zeckendorf was under such pressure to get this up and built. He kept S.J. Kessler and Sons on board, who were kind of the go-to urban renewal architect in Title I. Zeckendorf and Pace supposedly improved the site plan, and for the 2,500 apartments, a markedly different approach. We see this kind of cascading arrangements of apartments with these 4 slabs here on the left that face into Central Park. Downtown at Kips Plaza, between 1st and 2nd Avenues, 30th and 32nd Street, part of the overall Title I redevelopment project initiated by the city to improve middle-income housing, to provide middle-income housing to complement the NYU Bellevue Medical Center. 1,300 tenants were removed from their homes as part of this slum clearance project. Among the demolished buildings was the first Kips house from 1906. backed by steel magnate Henry Phipps, and today remains the oldest nonprofit developer of affordable housing in the city. This was designed by Grosvenor Atbury. His 3 6-story buildings included an interior courtyard for natural light and ventilation through these kind of heroic 4-story archways. Zeckendorf and Pay dismissed the original site and plan proposed by S.J. Kessler and Sons that called for 514 apartment buildings, which they felt was too institutional. However, Zeckendorf retained that firm, S.J. Kessler and Sons, to assist Pay through the building. For the apartment buildings, Hay and Freed designed 2 21-story apartment buildings in offset twin slabs stretching east and west, containing 560 apartments each, with an enormous open landscape plaza between them. Integrated parking underground, convenient drop-offs in front of both towers, and a commercial strip along 2nd Avenue. The new density for the site represented approximately 28% in terms of lot coverage. He said 2/3 is greater than the whole in real estate if you improve the third that's left. Set aside the third for gardens and playgrounds. You can enhance the value of a property in that way and it won't become a slum in 30 years. For Kips Bay, Pay and the team had no interest in designing a great housing complex and were already experimenting with concrete in Webb & Knapp's Hilton Hotel in Denver. They selected the material for a number of reasons. First, there was a shortage in structural steel during the Korean War. And while logic dictated that the designers could instead consider a reinforced concrete frame, they could not come to terms with that inherent contradiction of a mellow glass skin concerned with straight ceilings, which set a maximum base of $8,400 per room with an additional $1,000 allowed per room for New York City, given the higher construction costs. The floor plans here, a mix of studios to 3 bedrooms. We're actually only seeing half of the slab here. The slabs are so enormous, they're actually completely cut in 2, with 2 separate elevator banks and 2 separate access points through the main lobby. The promotional material of William Zeckendorf is endless. Supply cost and labor proved the biggest challenges for Webb & Knapp, and the concerns for sourcing, effects of coloring, thermal cracks persisted. Rather than give up on concrete when initial construction estimates came in at $18 a square foot against Zeckendorf's max budget of $11 a square foot, Zeckendorf purchased an industrial engineering company that specialized in concrete highways and bridges, enabling them to build at $10.15 a square foot, according to Pay. Needless to say, the project still went way over budget. Not everyone at Webb & Knapp was pleased with the costs of this type of research program and material experiments. Zeckendorf's own vice presidents complained that Pay's designs were too costly, they caused delays, they were totally custom, but Pay could always count on Zeckendorf to back him up. When one of the VPs once told Zeckendorf that the firm was running out of money and could not afford Pay's designs, he boomed, "We're talking about a man who, in my opinion, will go down in history as one of the greatest figures of our time." Although Pay and his team had anticipated that concrete would enable a quick pace in construction, cutting costs anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 months off of the overall schedule and thereby save money, at Kips Bay this was not the case. And the building structure cost more than a conventional masonry building of the same floor area. But Zeckendorf brushed the criticism aside and argued that the higher costs resulted from the experimental techniques and believed that as the construction crews gained more and more experience, the unit costs would decrease. The radical look of Kips Bay received mixed reception in the press. This was unlike anything anyone had seen in New York City. Ada Louise Huxtable proclaimed Pay an artist in concrete. He's used the most challenging of 20th century building materials, reinforced concrete, and it has afforded him the opportunity to create a completely new kind of design, she said. Progressive architecture found the interior and exterior at odds, criticizing the window's inability to receive a proper shade that did not compromise the design, covering the curved corners at the top of the windows. Indeed, today in some of the renovated apartments, you'll see a crown molding that prohibits your enjoyment of that original detail. And progressive architecture argued that the almost floor-to-ceiling glass windows were way more acceptable in commercial architecture than residential interiors, that they exposed too much. On the 2nd Avenue corridor, which you see here, was the retail component. Zeckendorf believed that small commercial establishments were a critical part of all of his Title I urban renewal projects, where you could create this experience where you could walk ideally to a grocery store. And behind that wall of the retail in the plaza was the playground. Here we are today. You can still see that pinwheel plan. The commercial structures have been enlarged. The concrete, of course, is still difficult for the on-site property management teams to keep looking great. And Pei and the team called this their prototype. They recognized that this was truly an experiment and continued to refine over and over and over again with their work with Zeckendorf on improvements, including a design solution for the air conditioners on the exterior. Probably one of the most enduring legacies of Kips Bay is its incredible garden, particularly in its maturity now. When you approach the slabs today, you still experience this kind of incredible monumentality. But the moment that you come into this private courtyard in the back, away from the grid, it's actually impossible to see the slabs in their entirety. You are always seeing them through the leaves, which is this kind of really wonderful experience. Some of the original lights are still there, others have unfortunately been replaced. I have a quick video to immerse you in the plaza to give you a little spin. Hopefully it will play. Maybe not. There we go. Thank you. This is a sculpture added later. Pei wanted to put the Picasso sculpture that we're going to see at Silver Towers here, but because they were over budget, Zeckendorf said you can have the trees or you can have the sculpture, and Pei chose the trees. Thank you. Here we are today with the playground in its original location and one of those apartments that is for sale. You can see the crown molding. In 59 of the most previous sales, they are averaging $1,020 in terms of price per square foot, and they're selling at an average of $764,000. The building went condo in the early 1980s, and with it, unfortunately, the closing off of the plaza as well to the public, for which a lot of the neighborhood really mourned. The lobby just underwent a extensive, really redesign, unfortunately. But the parking, both the drop-offs and some of the open-air parking, still are kind of a real luxury here in the city. But the cost of going over at Kips Bay had immediate consequence for Pei and Zeckendorf for Lincoln Towers. Zeckendorf and Pei had really high hopes for this third Title I project that Webb & Knapp took over from derelict sponsors. I'll just touch on this very briefly. What became known as Lincoln Towers was tied to the most carefully watched, highest profile urban renewal project in the United States, and that was, of course, Lincoln Center. The housing portion is at the top there. Pei went to work, designing a complex that mixed high-rise apartments with low-rise single-family residences, the same approach that he proposed in Southwest Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Chicago, and Pittsburgh. Though in Pittsburgh it wasn't ultimately realized. But unfortunately, word had spread that Webb & Knapp had exceeded the original budget at Kips Bay, and the finance firm, Lazard Ferrers, the equity partner on the project, resolved to maximize profit at Lincoln Towers by not making what they saw as costly design decisions. They really resisted Pei coming on board as the designer, and they fought with him over design items, large and small, and they forced Zeckendorf to take him off the job, and instead insisted on retaining S.J. Kessler and Sons. Pei was not to design housing along the list of A-list architects working on the cultural center, by which he was extremely frustrated by. It certainly also gives a very good overlay of density for the purpose of this exhibit. The model. Lincoln Towers was the largest residential project that Webb & Knapp would ever take on, and Zeckendorf was very ashamed in the final product, as he writes in his autobiography. and believed that for a slight increase in cost, Lincoln Towers could have been a really distinct, forward-thinking complex, but instead, strong-armed by his partner, he had baked the buildings that he had sought so hard to avoid. He wrote, "When these towers are torn down, no one will mourn their passing, but the builder or politician who moves to tear down Kips Bay will have some angry citizen troops on their hands." Kips Bay was no surrender, but a genuine advance in the quality of city living, which is what Webb and Knapp's finest projects were all about. The delays and red tape of Title I placed almost 10 years of financial strain on Webb and Knapp as construction costs grew and occupancy proved really slow. Part of the appeal for Zeckendorf to enter the construction business had been to build rental buildings for their consistent annual income. Yet now he was forced to sell many of his Title I projects prematurely to generate immediate capital for some of his other projects in peril. Pei must have seen the writing on the wall. He had taken some critical steps towards independence while in Zeckendorf's employ. And with Zeckendorf's permission, while he was on staff, he took on 2 outside projects, the Lewis Memorial Chapel and the Green Center for Earth Science at MIT. He also became a citizen in 1954, and the following year, 1955, formed I.M. Pei & Associates, while still serving as the in-house architect for Webb and Knapp. He formed I.M. Pei & Associates, of course, with Henry Cobb and Ethan Leonard, who were founders and then became partners. But Pei and the team were still working working exclusively for Zeckendorf and remained physically in the Webb and Knapp office for an additional 5 years, which is a point that some histories don't make totally clear. So after this 12-year partnership in August of 1960, 43 years old, Pei splits very amicably from Zeckendorf as Webb and Knapp begins to buckle under financial stress, including the purported $750,000 annual cost to keep Pei and the rest of the design team on payroll. Never did Zeckendorf blame the designs of the projects for any part of his company's failure. Webb and Knapp was spread too thin in too many locations to see his properties through at such a challenging time, and he also just had some bad deals. "The flaw was in me," he wrote, rather than the projects, and to the end he remained fiercely protective of Pei's designs and their achievement together. So 2 months after they split, Pei and his team, began negotiations with NYU for the University Village project. Though not a Webb and Knapp project, University Village is an extension of the urban renewal solutions that Pei established with Zeckendorf, a refinement, as his team called it, of the earlier prototype of Kips Bay Plaza. It was in fact the volume of work that I.M. Pei & Associates had underway under construction with Zeckendorf that won the firm the NYU Housing Commission. As part of the proposal, Easton Leonard wrote, "Our recent work in urban renewal has assured us that within the limits of very low construction budgets, much can be done to improve standards in urban apartment living. And indeed, Silver Towers will be built on time and on budget." Here's Moses's proposal. Located just 2 blocks south of Washington Square, University Village was part of the Washington Square Southeast Title I project initiated by Moses in '53 for slum clearance of 9 blocks of Greenwich Village. 191 mostly commercial buildings were identified for demolition to be replaced by middle-income housing and educational buildings on 3 new super blocks. The original scheme for the area was prepared by Eggers and Higgins, which proposed 9 14-story structures housing a total of 2,100 middle-income apartments on the 2 southern super blocks. Moses awarded sponsorship to the residential blocks to the Washington Square Corporation, which was a syndicate headed by developers Paul Tishman and Morton Wolf, who commissioned Paul Lester Wiener as a consultant to the designer, again, S.J. Kessler & Sons, to design Washington Square Village, the 2 apartment slabs with multicolored glazed brick on 1/3 of the site. Their 3rd building, which really was going to be an identical slab planned for the southernmost block, which you can see here at the bottom, was canceled in 1960 for unclear reasons, and NYU quickly announced its interest in purchasing that superblock for faculty and married student housing. This coincided with NYU's ambitious acquisition and building program in the post-World War II era to grow its holdings in the neighborhood. NYU's announcement spurred protests by local village groups, as the lot had originally been intended for middle-income housing, which theoretically displaced residents would have first access to. And in September of 1960, the Board of Estimate granted NYU permission to purchase the land with the requirement that 1/3 of the housing be designated as middle-income housing for people who did work or live in the area. And this resulted in a limited equity co-op apartment building financed with subsidized low-interest mortgage from the Mitchell-Lama housing program. As at Kips Bay, Pay asked James and Goffrey to lead the design for the 5-acre site. This is an early scheme showing the proposal for low-rise, kind of zigzagging structure with 2 more high-rise structures. But the plan was further simplified, especially after NYU actually purchased the Washington Square Village complex, and ultimately 3 identical towers were arrived at, streamlining the design and offering substantial construction savings. This was just 14% of the lot coverage, or 76 people per acre, as this exhibit notes. Each floor contains 6 apartment buildings, 6 apartments of just 2 and 3 bedrooms with double exposures. We have the floor plan here. When the design was announced to the public, critics complained that the towers were way out of scale with the neighborhood, and Pay and the team replied that for the site and for the purpose, high-rise buildings were the only solution, and that a grouping of low-rise structures dense in lot coverage would do more to violate the scale of the village, is what they told the New York Times. According to Freed, this plan would also provide large and as flexible land as possible set aside for future use, which is an interesting point for the 21st century. 2 of the towers were designated as faculty and student housing, and the 3rd, as I mentioned, was a co-op. So the team had continued to advance their concrete experimentations. They had moved on to what they fiberglass molds, which we're seeing here in their Hyde Park, Chicago project, and they applied them here at University Village as well with general contractor Tishman Construction to much success. The defining grid facade at University Village, here they are under construction, had each tower was rotated slightly different onto the property, again around a kind of pinwheel plan. 4 windows on the short side and 8 on the others, contrasted with a 22-foot wide shear wall at the corners, which is kind of a welcome relief from the rigidity of the windows. The recessed windows emphasize the striking facade as at Kips Bay, but unlike Kips Bay, the heating and AC systems were successfully incorporated into the structural facade. The towers were pulled back away from the busy thoroughfare of Houston Street and serve as a visual termination of the neighborhood, certainly out of scale, but not unlike the positioning and strategy behind the 3 towers of Society Hill on the left, which were done with Zeckendorf. An access road here at Silver Towers that runs through the site. It's closed to cars, but open only for foot traffic or deliveries and for move-ins. And it extends the former Wooster Street link between Houston and Bleecker Streets. It kind of shows how Pay was rethinking the super block strategy and its relationship to the grid. On the north portion of the site is this lovely grove of oak trees that creates a nice buffer, and on the south, 2 underground parking garages. And Pay and the team designed every detail, which was really typical for their projects, including the bubble lighting, down to the applied font for all of the building signage. No detail was lost to the team. And of course, we have the bust of Sylvette. And the entire plan kind of circulates around her, offset slightly in this kind of nice tension. So this was sculpted by Carl Nestor, based on a sculpture by Pablo Picasso. It really is one of the finest public art sculptures in New York City, and it's delightful to encounter to this day. Its successful placement is a credit to Pay, who himself was a collector of modern art, and he took this on as kind of a one-man crusade to bring the Picasso to one of his projects. The project won numerous awards immediately after completion, and the apartments continued to be highly sought after for their light-filled interiors and their spectacular views, particularly to the south. I have one more video here, thank you, to just give you a taste of standing from Houston Street, looking up at the facade here, which the concrete's in much better shape here than at Kips Bay Plaza. Here we are today. And in recent years, and we'll end here and begin our, I'll turn the time over to Lynne. In recent years, the complex has come to the forefront of debate surrounding density, with NYU proposing adding 4 new structures to the 2 original super blocks as part of its 2031 core expansion plan, including a 4th tower here, added to the University Plaza or Silver Tower superblock site. The Greenwich Village Society of Historic Preservation first proposed landmarking Silver Towers project in 2003, built a coalition of support. NYU originally opposed the designation and later relented, and the pay portion of the superblock was successfully landmarked in 2008, a really unique instance for a Title I project to receive this type of protection. And in so doing, the commissioner stressed the importance of the site planning as much as the buildings themselves, landmarking the oak trees onto the site. And to the west of the towers, NYU has already demolished their low-rise athletic center in preparation for their new, here's the construction site from last week. I'll get this, and this lovely urban farm on this sliver of property on Houston Street. Again, it's really creative kind of rethinking of what to do with some of these, how to program some of these open green spaces. Oh, I'm sorry, I guess I didn't have the other image. Just to end, Pace set the bar extremely high in how to achieve quality housing under extremely tough constraints and financing. And his relationship with Zeckendorf was truly a symbiotic one, and it enabled them to push real boundaries in how to reconsider a more collaborative practice between architect and developer, given the realities of real estate economics and the politics of the city. And their collaboration, I argue, offers lessons on how we can approach our ever-evolving cities on thinking big and small, and rethinking traditional relationships between client and consultant by offering more transparency and commitment to marrying economics and design to be flexible enough to adapt to changing market needs. Thank you.
Listen to Marci talk about Pay's work with Zeckendorf during the early 50s, and one of the points she makes early on, and since it was a lengthy talk with a lot of good detail, you might have, forgotten this point, but the point she makes is that Pay's talent was such that his eventual success was evident early on, and Zeckendorf really offered Pay the opportunity he wanted, which was to think and design big. And Zeckendorf himself says this in his autobiography, when he says the same thing, that Pay was so talented. But what he also says, with no short amount of pride, is that we gave him and his partners the gift of time, with an accelerated boost up the ladder, plus some developers' insight into the use of land. And I think that's right. And unusual, because it isn't common for an architect to really understand the development business as thoroughly as one might if you're an in-house architect. And that brings me to the first point I want to make in sort of setting the context here, which is when Zeckendorf hired Pay, he was following an old, if forgotten tradition, New York tradition of the in-house architect. Fred French and Erwin Channing, 2 of the 1920s most outstanding developers, both had in-house architects. Fred French had H. Douglas Ives, who worked for French on everything except the French building. And Channing had Jacques Delamare, who worked on everything but the Chattanooga building. So somehow these two, they used in-house architects for everything but their signature building. But nonetheless, there was this New York tradition of having an in-house architect because the relationship was both economical and efficient. And in the case of pay, it was symbiotic. A second element of the New York tradition, which we tend to forget, is the architect as, we now say the architect as developer, particularly if you think of Boston and Grand Gulf, but it was the architect as builder, because the word developer really wasn't used until sometime in maybe the 1920s it came about, but it certainly wasn't used in the latter half of the 19th century when architects really were builders. Many of them were builders. So who were these people? Well, Ernest Flagg, who designed the Singer Building and was a tenement reformer. Before he became an architect, he was a developer of co-op buildings. Okay. Then there was Clarence True. You've probably never heard of these people, okay? But it's important that you remember that New York City was built by so many small builders and developers, and not just the names that survived over time. So Clarence True was a prolific developer of row houses on the Upper West Side in the last decade of the 19th century. And then there are a couple of other unknowns worth mentioning, okay? John, and I would never have known these without Christopher Gray, who is sort of, may he rest in peace. His work is still embellishing all of our work. John Williamson developed in Soho, and Christopher Gray called Williams an unorthodox architect-developer. The mid-19th century tradition of developers acting as their own architects had largely disappeared by the time Williams was active, he wrote. But Williams styled himself, quote unquote, as civil engineer, architect, capitalist, and generally set his own course. And in the 20th century, you had other unknowns, George David Brown and William Gunther, who were developers of three well-known Inwood projects up in the Riverdale section. Among architectural professionals, merging the roles of architect and builder-developer, that is, merging the aesthetics and commerce, was a long-held taboo. And those of the architects in the audience, I'm sure you know this well. It went against the architectural tradition of the gentleman architect, the elite tradition of the gentleman architect. The very definition of an architect's professionalism depended upon rising above the low world of commerce. Okay? And this ethical bias was very much alive when Pei, who was not yet a licensed architect when he joined Zeckendorf. Harry Cobb was a licensed architect before Pei. And Cobb says in his recent memoir, which is a delight to read, I encourage all of you to read it, he said, the AIA was very unhappy about this. He said, it was not a good thing to do. He said, especially for people with the kind of aspirations we had. People said we were thumbing our noses at the profession. And indeed we were, he said. So the last point this brings me to the last point I want to make, which, while Zeckendorf cut a distinctive figure for his vision and his imagination and his entrepreneurial zeal, and he's still, 100 years later, people are still will be talking about him. Behind that vision and the well-founded belief that he was a developer who was not singularly out for profit, there was a fundamental principle of commercial real estate in his thinking, and that was the creation of value. As a developer, Zeckendorf had a keen eye and a total enjoyment for the complexities and strategy of land assemblage. And he sought land in areas that were not well established, where land was inexpensive relative to the established places, certainly in Manhattan. And everybody cites the UN example, okay? But in hiring Pei, he was securing the talent he needed, as Marci said, and others say, to execute on his vision. But I would argue that Pei's talent was absolutely distinctive, was essential to transform this nondescript locations that he chose, that Zeckendorf chose, and enhance the economic value of it with his design. And that includes Title I projects. It was why Zeckendorf, I believe, needed an architect of distinctive vision, and why in Pei he saw something that was exactly what he needed and wanted. So the argument I'm making is that you have to understand, as well as Marci presents, the architect's and Pei's view of how it was such a boost to his career. I'm also saying you need to understand the developer's perspective of why Pei is so attractive to somebody like Zeckendorf, who had a vision about how to create value in fundamental economics. And so with that, I would like to open it up to questions from the audience for Marci. And I will sit down.
Do you have anything you want to say in response to Lynne?
No, I would also add that one of the original founders was Elliot Cross, who was one of the original founders of Webb and Knapp. So speaking to that tradition of in-house architects and the architect as developer.
Well, people forget, and for good reason, that Zeckendorf learned a lot because during World War II, he took over the Astor estate properties and managed them. So he in managing those properties, I think we could probably go back and figure out that he learned a lot about the early part of the 20th century real estate dealings because he was managing what was a typical situation. Our skyscraper and podium. So there must be questions. I'm supposed to moderate, but Marci's here, so I'll just. Questions.
I'm sure there are a lot of people.
Marci knows a lot more than you talked about, so please ask questions about Pei.
Yeah.
This is not a question about pay, but about the longevity of some of these projects. I live in Park West Village and have lived there for over 50 years, which is Webb and Knapp, not Pei. And the people I know who live in Lincoln Towers and have lived there a long time are quite happy, as are the residents of Park West Village, pretty much.
Yeah.
Although we've had a series of, Webb and Knapp didn't hold on to it long.
Correct. Yeah, they
Zeckendorf
sold in
it to
62.
his golf buddy, the head of Alcoa,
Yes.
who didn't really intend to stay in building management, and sold it to Helmsley. But my question is related to the longevity of it. Whether you know, are people I know in the NYU Washington thing who've been there are quite happy.
Yeah.
Over long periods of time.
Yes, and from the residents that I've spoken with at Kips Bay, and some of the management staff who've worked there for 30 plus years, it's a true community, and people love it. Yeah, which certainly complicates, the kind of traditional bias narrative of urban renewal to quickly kind of dismiss it as failed policy only and not consider the spaces that people like Zeckendorf and Pei and other creative developer architect duos were creating for individuals to create lives together.
Well, we've had plenty of fights with the manager.
I'm sure.
But the buildings have,
Yes.
done well, and we in them.
Thank you, Lynne.
Just a comment, it's great for the residents. I mean, I'd love to live in Kips Bay, but I worked at NYU and at Bellevue, and those apartment buildings just kill that neighborhood. I mean, the people don't get to go in that lovely landscaped area, and it's really horrible to get around that, and it offers nothing to the community that doesn't live there. It's really horrible in my estimation as a non-resident.
It's a shame that they closed the garden to the public.
Yeah, it is, and that was the course. That was the condo board, right, taking over and deciding to close the gates.
So I have a question.
You said duo, but
Yes.
I know that part of what you had to cut out for lack of time tonight was a little bit about the very little bit that you added about kind of the shop, the in-house shop of Pei and his colleagues who worked, for and with Zeckendorf. Can you flesh that out a little bit? You mentioned Freed and the relationship as the lead designer. So there's a little bit of ambiguity about how many people were on the team. And
Sure. So from what I've been able to find, the staff got up to about 50 people while they were still at Web and Nap. Harry Cobb was the first to join. He actually came down to help Pei finish the Helix model. And Zeckendorf was really smitten with Cobb and said yes when Pei said, please, I am underwater, I have way too much work to do, I need someone to help me out. And Cobb had been Pei's student at the GSD. So I mean, the team that they assembled, whether it was someone who excelled in concrete, or Vincent Ponte, who was one of the kind of most talented early large-scale urban planners of the era, and on the Zeckendorf and on the kind of development team side, it's Charles Erstadt, it's Billy Rose, the fabulous theater professional who did the Aquacade at the World's Fair. So it's kind of this dream team that Zeckendorf and Pei are able to assemble within Web and Nap. Yeah. Yes, Vishal.
Hi, Marci.
Hi.
So I'm struck in your presentation and even in some of the questions about how impossible this would be today.
Yeah.
Which I'm so glad you're highlighting the entire history of it, because actually my son was born in Kips Bay Plaza. It was a wonderful place to live, and I would actually take issue with the fact that they don't give anything to the neighborhoods around them, because I think one of the things they actually give, both Kips Bay Plaza and Silver Towers, is light and air. There's much more light and air on those streets and those blocks than in most of New York City, because height, when it's given in a sort of thin form, can actually produce a lot more light with the same amount of density than a squat, fat building that blocks most of the light that's only half the height, but much more massive. And I'm just struck by also even the change in, when you talk about in-house architects, Lynne, the fact that Zeckendorf said, oh, the concrete's over budget, I'm going to buy a concrete factory. No developer today would do that, right? In an effort to see this done. And what I guess what I'm worried about, and if you have thoughts on, is, I know that the city is noticeably much more anti-development today for lots of reasons, and we don't have to argue that. But I think in addition to being anti-development, it's becoming dangerously anti-innovation. That between what zoning demands, what a developer demands, what communities demand, architects are really given the choice of picking paint color on a building. And there is almost no ability to innovate in the way that we're looking at right now. And as a city that prides itself on being a global capital, I would ask whether that's healthy.
Well, I would say no, of course not healthy. And the question is, and I certainly do not have the answer, but it's something I certainly think about both as an architectural historian and as a professional actively working in real estate development. And that is, how do we create real opportunity for innovation and for people to come to the table, right? And to really push through, some of the noise when some of these different stakeholders perhaps get a little bit too loud. But what are other comments on this?
There was another question in the back there before Vishal. Mark?
I'm tempted to answer that question as well. So I'm actually, let me take a little different point of view than Vishal did, which is, so I get it, lots of light and air, but they strike me as not urban. And as you talked about the garden on Houston Street, well, that just separates, that from walking. There's a difference between you know, when we have a lot
That's a
of
great point,
things
Marci.
about housing authority here too. You walk by them and you know that this is a housing authority and it's not related to the street at all.
Sure.
Did Pei worry about that at all, or he just was off on this idea of building these beautiful
That's a
buildings?
great question, and you know, I do know that it was strategic for Webinap as a team to position these buildings as having the best of both worlds as far as their messaging to people. They had to play to the market. They had to attract people to come and to pay what were high rents, right? Responding to the market. And when you look at the way that they speak and talk about the projects, it's the city views and the convenience of Manhattan, but you have the suburban ease of parking and of this landscape. Zeckendorf said there's nothing that a little bit of the countryside can't fix in the city, right? There's this real belief.
But that is a theme that would even influence Tudor City. That I mean, the quest for light and air and to lighten the congestion in cities in the first half of the 20th century influenced what happened in the second half of the 20th century. And what I find interesting in thinking about what you presented about the Kips Bay Towers compared to the Society Hill Towers in Philadelphia, which I know quite well. The site in Philadelphia is much smaller, and so you do not get this suburban feel that you get over Kips Bay because the site is so much smaller and it's compressed. Yes, you still have open space, but it doesn't feel suburban the way it does.
Yeah.
That it's,
I personally agree with the anti-urban critique of the projects, the Silver Towers projects in Kips Bay, but let me speak for Nick Bloom, the guest curator, who isn't able to be here tonight. He's in California, but I know that he would say, because he has on previous occasions talked about the Mitchell-Lama projects as the answer to suburbanization, at least the attempt in terms of social policy to find some way to keep the middle class in the city with all of the attractions of better schools and FHA loans and all the things that were decentralizing the city, either pushing people out or attracting them away. And so he makes the point that it was the government officials who believed that it was, whether it was Robert Moses or any of the mayors after, it was absolutely essential to them to keep a working class base in the city, and therefore federal funds were attracted in order to purchase land that was privately owned with a developer in the mix, so that the city or public housing wasn't footing the full bill for the construction costs. So this was a marriage of interests that really predicts, Vishaan, I think the trajectory of the 20th century is to find public-private partnerships in order to make these things work, rather than to be entirely on the public taxes budget. And it was a necessary, everyone I think honestly felt at the time, a necessary balance to the trajectory of suburbanization.
Right. I mean, can we tie the two conversations together? Because I would really challenge the definition of urban. The definition of urban has become street walls with a store on the bottom. And to bring it to the 21st century, those stores are all empty. Right? And so, or at least a third of them are, and they're not getting any better. Right? And so, I mean, I don't know about you guys, when I walk down LaGuardia Place, I always cut through that little hole through the two other NYU slabs, whose name I forget, down that driveway, down through Silver Towers to get to Houston Street. That's just as urban an experience, I would argue, as walking by $7 million townhouses in the West Village. And, you know, I just think it's important that we're careful about what we privilege, because the point Carol's making was also about, you know, urbanity defined by a different set of standards, which is bringing different people into the city and not just the sort of cloister of the brownstone. And so, you know, I just, you know, I'm not going to defend the parking lot in front of Kips today, but like, I just think it gets really dangerous when we use these terms in these dogmatic kind of ways. These folks were experimenting with things and trying, you know, if you go to the Barbican in East London, it's extraordinarily urban and it doesn't follow any of the Jane Jacobs rules. And I think it's important that people be allowed to think more innovatively about the future of the city than saying, you know, here are the ways in which we define urban.
I agree with that, but I just want to say, when you're walking through the Washington Square Village of NYU, it's a very different experience. You're going through 600-foot slabs, through sort of an arch. It's not as inviting. The Sasaki Garden, you got to take like 3 or 4 steps, even if you know it's there.
Right.
So when you emerge at Silver Towers, there's no gate to go through. There's a copse of trees over there. Then there's a view all the way downtown. So there's a Rue Piéton that continues through. It gets better though at Silver Towers, certainly. So I'm wondering, why aren't developers, if they have a lot on one side of the street and a lot on the other side of the street, why aren't they, as Pay and I guess NYU did, not privatizing, but demapping that street and making it a Rue Piéton? Why isn't that a model anymore to have that? Keep the street grid, but deny cars here and there, as Bloomberg tried to do here and there. Is that happening in development to sort of?
I mean, I certainly don't see it as much. I think that the backlash was so severe against the reclaiming of the street right through eminent domain.
But that's public. That street through Silver is public. At Kips Bay, for some, well, there was no street running through. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, they visually kept the street extending from the other super block to the north, as you mentioned, but it's actually for practical purposes, and that didn't strike me until I was revisiting again last week, is you have to move people in.
Yeah.
You need UPS trucks to drop off
So
stuff.
it's a
at the beginning of
semi-public
the-
realm.
Yes.
And you're invited into that semi-public realm, which is when you're way down to Soho or whatever. One other question is, so as Pay moves from Web and Nap with this liaison with someone who really understands him, working together, and he starts getting other types of clients, NYU, for example. Why didn't he do 9 other buildings at NYU? What was the dynamic that changed from having one client who really believed in you to working with boards and working with people who also had different kinds of egos?
That's a great question. I can't speak to the decisions of why the firm didn't pursue opportunity if there was opportunity with one client. But I will say that Pay and the team were really known for and celebrated for being able to deal with exceptionally difficult clients, right? And he credits Zeckendorf to his success even when he gets to the Louvre, and he says in hindsight, I would have never been able to survive that process had I not learned how to work through the politics of working with the city, working with the government, that I learned in Zeckendorf's office. Yeah.
That seems like a kind of an appropriate,
Marta,
Marta, you
yes.
by history, the last question.
Yes.
Actually, 2. So two questions. One, you showed some extraordinary renderings.
Yes.
And I wonder how the production of renderings was handled in the WebNap
Yes.
Pay partnership.
Known for their love to find out.
Okay.
But they did have an in-house model studio at Web and Nap, which was kind of unheard of in the industry at the time, and they were doing those beautiful line drawings by hand. Don Page was the head of graphics for the team for a long time. I don't know how many years before he broke off. Sol LeWitt was in the office for about a year. He did the promotional material for Roosevelt Field Mall, the Roosevelt Mall Shopping Center. We didn't even touch on Zeckendorf's exploits into the suburbs. He's doing it at the same time, some of them with Pay. So, yeah, in-house. Yeah.
And Pei takes that team with him? Like
He takes the team with him. Yeah.
So it's not a Zeckendorf promo?
No, no, and they actually stay in the Webb and Knapp building, paying kind of like a token lease for a couple more years. So Pei and the team have a front row seat as Zeckendorf continued to kind of crumble and declare bankruptcy in 1965.
So then the second question, I was fascinated to see, and I don't remember this in the dissertation, my memory may be mistaken, but there were experiments with integrating high-rise and low-rise housing.
Yes.
And super interesting.
Yes.
And super important. And one wonders why that failed in New York when it succeeds so vibrantly in places like Southwest Washington.
Yeah.
And succeeds in a way that assures a social diversity in projects that we don't see in the Zeckendorf projects at all.
Yeah, yeah, good. That's a great question. Well, so Zeckendorf and Pei did the combination of low and high rise successfully together in Hyde Park in Chicago.
No, I've stayed in some of those buildings. Yeah,
What was that?
Society.
I've stayed in some of them.
Ah, yes,
Yeah.
yes. So Hyde Park and of course Society Hill. Why they didn't do it in New York, I'm not sure. It's a great question. When if you look at some of the early plans that Pei was doing for the master plan for Southwest Washington, he seemed to be really taken by the offset slabs. You kind of see them repeated over and over and over again in that scheme. And for whatever reason, perhaps with the direction that Second Avenue must remain retail across the entire frontage, and along First Avenue, that was also given to a separate use. It was a building built in the 1980s. So he may have been constrained to access to the residential portions from the streets as opposed to the avenues, and that was the solution. But it's a great question why it didn't work in New York. I would have loved to have seen a low-rise, high-rise
It does
mix.
work at Cooper Square Village. I mean, the community organizes to demand that kind of integration of not only physical form, but also social. What it had, the consequences that means for social inclusion. It's an interesting question.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we could have endless questions and answers, and we do have a reception, so you'll be able to ask your individual question of Marci later, but I think we thank you for taking a magnifying lens to the relevant projects for this exhibition, and that was a great service to us all, but there's clearly an appetite for more, so we encourage you to get that book out soon.
I will.
And we'll try to help you with the questions. Thank you. I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum, and the person who is in charge of turning on and off the HVAC. So I'm warning you now, I'm going to hand these out because these are not only flyers for the exhibition, but they can also serve as fans to keep you cool once things start to go. The temperature rises, and I thank you for getting down here tonight on an extraordinarily uncomfortable day in the city, and probably the first of a whole series of them. So this is the fourth talk in the series that was inspired by and expands the topic of this exhibition, which is housing density. And I was not the curator for this exhibition, and rather it's Nicholas Bloom who gave the talk last week on, along with the graphic designer for the exhibition, Leo Tamargo, who was working on our staff on the show throughout and with me on those issues. Gave a talk on Nietzsche, the birth of Nietzsche, and called Prodigy of the Depression, Nietzsche and the birth of a new housing model for New York. This series and this exhibition explores the idea of density and housing and the reinvention of the New York landscape from the 19th century tenements to the mid-20th century towers in the park. And Nicholas Bloom, who's a historian of social policy and especially of the New York City Housing Authority, wrote a book on Nietzsche called Public Housing That Worked in the past tense, but we hope maybe someday it will work again, has as its subtext a kind of relevance and topicality to what happens in the future on these sites, the public housing sites in the city, and publicly assisted housing is also our subject. Because, as you all know from reading the newspapers, the decline of this housing fabric seems to offer an impossible situation, but also a tantalizing opportunity to be able to build on some of those sites. And one of the key messages of this exhibition is that there are two kinds of density of population, but also density of ground coverage, of built area. And I invite you to go around the exhibition now, afterwards or another time, or go to our website where you can read all of the text. Because it's this topic that we wanted to continue to expand in explorations in lectures. The first one was on the decorated tenement. Zachary Violet, who did his dissertation on that topic, immigrant entrepreneurs who built tenement housing not to exploit the working classes, but rather to house them with dignity, which is the fundamental argument of his book. And the second of the topics was on NYCHA and the birth of this new model of development for large-scale working-class housing. And actually, I'm leaving one out, but I want to get quickly to Marci Clark, who also wrote her dissertation on a topic that addresses urban renewal as a broad topic, and begins to bring us into the post-war chronology that we haven't yet to explore in this series. So Marci finished her dissertation at the Grad Center at CUNY, City University of New York, in 2017, and she has since. And the topic is the topic of tonight, but the title is IMP William Zeckendorf and I can't read my handwriting.
The Architecture of Urban Renewal.
The Architecture, that's the word, I couldn't read, the Architecture of Urban Renewal. But the reason I was confused is that I wanted to talk about real estate and real estate development, because that also is a connection to her current position, which is as the development director at JDS, which is a kind of skyrocketing and sky-high development firm, probably best known to most of you as the developer of 111 West 57th Street on the Billionaires Row, with this very skinniest of the towers designed by shop architects, with an extraordinary slenderness ratio that looks like a kind of miracle of engineering, of defiant engineering. And JDS does a whole range of projects. They did the American Copper buildings, which is a leaning kind of inflected buildings, and they're working in Brooklyn in a super, not super tall, but a very tall building, and a whole series of other developments simultaneously. So she's a very busy lady, in addition to being the mother of a just 1 year old this week baby. So we're really happy to have her here tonight with all of her multiple talents and the history that she's going to bring to us, because the lecture series and the exhibition wanted to explore a kind of contraposition of public and private. And we wanted to be able to look with a clear eye at development, or builders as they were called in the day, and Lynne Sagalyn is going to make that point in some comments as she frames or reframes some of the issues of this focus talk into a broader history of development in the city and architecture and developer collaborations. So this title that I've just described of Marci's dissertation is the kind of exploratory work that hasn't been done really in art history circles. I like to think that I did something, 30 years ago in the day, to look at commercial architecture as if it were architecture, and to look at it
as
architecture. Yeah, exactly. Well, I always thought so, but not everybody did in in the art history circles. And to look at developers as people who are city builders.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So to bring the idea of the developer builder into a context where you can really, where you can understand better motivations other than pure money, and to not cast aspersions by a kind of, you know, automatic knee-jerk reaction about what developers do, is the aspiration of a few people who've looked into these areas, including Marci and Marty Gutman, who was her advisor at CUNY, and the late Hilary Ballin, very much encouraged this perspective on urbanism. So Marci will be talking for, as soon as I get off, a shorter amount of time as soon as I get off, and we'll present the kind of detail that we always have been dying to know about the collaboration of architect and architect, about this fascinating character of William Zeckendorf, who was definitely larger in life and had the highs and lows, which are dramatized in his fabulous autobiography of William Zeckendorf. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend. So that kind of detail where she's dug in and where she's analyzed is the kind of thing that I need to give the largest possible amount of time. After she talks, then Lynne Sagalyn, who is a professor now Emerita as of last spring at Columbia, and is expert on real estate and the history of real estate and of planning, the author of Times Square Roulette and Power at Ground Zero, also a Skyscraper Museum board member, a valued and a valued colleague for us, an advisor. So she has been thinking about these issues of Zeckendorf for a long time, and we had lunch together and talked about the ways that we might, with our seniority and experience, approach some of these issues. So in that constructive spirit of the evenings, they're like, what is the next step for this? We'd like to engage Lynne in making some comments, and then you in questions and conversation. Okay, so Marci.